ahead.
Alright, for part 2 of Candide versus the Boondocks, I'm going to be talking about this time the 5 main characters and the 5 different of each different source, and the 5 different archetypes each one of them falls under. The self-hating or the pessimistic, the misguided and ignorant, the moocher, the innocent or the product, and last but not least, the defier. I'm going to start in that order and show you how each one has a little bit of a parallel between them. Now, first starting off with the easiest one, the self-hating and the pessimistic. Both of these people are the ones that understand the world and see it as a way to hate themselves, in a sense, and they view it in a negative light. For example, the main character, Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks, is an African-American man himself, but he hates everything to do with African-American culture. He literally has at multiple points quoted saying, "Praise the white man and hold him dearly." And actually, there's actually a really interesting quote where he says, and I quote, "I am a very spiritual person. I start each day by thanking the white man for the sunshine." And very similar quotes like that. He often calls people of his own cultures monkeys, blackies, go back to the jungle, slavery wasn't all that bad, and so on and so forth. He is someone who is extremely degradational towards himself and other people. He views them as like a hopeless situation, and that we should just accept things as they are. He understands the world is disgusting, and he understands the world is broken, but he doesn't care. And if anything, he wants to almost go under that system. The same thing with Martin, in a sense, where he understands the world is not the best of all possible worlds, but instead of just accepting that fact, he goes to the extreme and decides that this is the worst of all possible worlds, that everything is not for the best, but everything is for the worst. In a sense, they're kind of a little bit of a foil to the next part, the misguided and the ignorant. They show the negative side of humanity. What would happen if we actually gave up on the world, which is kind of the big thing. They have given up. They have let themselves go, in a sense, and accepted their fates, but for the worst part. On the other side, however, is the optimist, the misguided and the ignorant, in a sense. And those two characters are Thomas Dubois from the Boondocks and Dr. Pangloss from Candide. Now, both of these characters are basically the people who try to uphold the very idea of that we're trying to get rid of. For example, with Boondocks, it's that segregation and racism is gone altogether and that we are all equal and all free. Whereas Pangloss, it's that this is the best of all possible worlds. And oftentimes they're very out of character in terms of tone and style with the rest of the story. They're the odd man out, in a sense. They're the one that everybody views as like the ignorant yokel, the person who's way too naive, in a sense, the idiot, in a sense. Pangloss at one point is literally quoted saying, that we need noses so we can have spectacles, and we need legs so we can wear pants, in a sense. They're extremely ignorant, and oftentimes their ignorance leads to comedic effect, as they're the ones that get the most torment and abuse, usually. They are tormented for comedy's sake, from their ignorance. One good example is with Pangloss. He actually is someone who, when talking after the earthquake in Madrid, he decides to talk about how this is for the best and everything will be okay, but it's that exact same talking. He was trying to cheer people up, and even though this is Catholic doctrine, people decide to hang him anyway because he's an outsider. He's someone who has a different point of view from everyone else. He's overly optimistic. It's the very thing that he's trying to point out the Catholic Church has been saying so long that gets him hanged by the Spanish Inquisition. Same thing with Mr. Dubois. There's actually a really good case in the second episode called The Trial of R. Kelly, where he believes that racism will not play in a case where R. Kelly has urinated on a 14-year-old girl in an act of sexual conduct. He is fully confident that he will win the case because racism will not play a part in it, and just because R. Kelly is black doesn't mean that it will affect the case. But actually, to his surprise, the defendant is actually able to win the case using racial slurs and the African-American jury's own biases against Tom. They had literally an actual videotape of him urinating on the people with a confession, DNA evidence. Even the 14-year-old girl admitted to herself that she was underage and that R. Kelly urinated on her, an act of sexual conduct with a minor, and they still lost. They're basically built up as, in a sense, the person that is trying to hold up the standard and then get it torn down. And that's not to say that there isn't merit to them. Tom is still the optimist. He's still the guy who sees that there's good in the world and wants to help it, in a sense. But he's ignorant on how to do it. He doesn't realize that there are still struggles, that we aren't perfect. The same thing with Pangloss. He wants to see the good, but he doesn't want to see the bad. Moving on, we have the other person, who's kind of the middle way of both of them. They both understand that the world is bad and good at the same time. But the thing is, unlike these two, they aren't really they're trying to play both sides for their advantage. They take whatever is convenient. The moocher, in a sense. One example is Grandad from the show Robert Freeman, in a sense. He is a man who is older in his age, and he usually doesn't really care too much about race relations, or, for that matter, the fact that we are oppressed. He doesn't really care about that, or the fact that we should be equal. He seems to do whatever he can to make things easier on him. There's actually a good quote in the first episode where literally he goes on a huge speech about how the new white man likes cheese, gourmet cheese. He actually is quoted saying, if you give the meanest white son of a bee a piece of gourmet cheese, he'll turn into Mr. Rogers. And he actually gets in a fight with Huey, saying that yes, you can tame white supremacy with cheese. And he is continuously seen that way, trying to press his own advantage to get better on in life by taking advantage of the system and just doing whatever is easiest for him. He's not going either side. The same thing is said with Cunigande, who, in a sense, is someone who tries to stay true to herself, but she doesn't seem to care which side she goes for. At one point she said she will go to Candide, but the next point she goes to the Lord Baron in Brazil, in a sense, and she decides to go with whatever will get her an advantage in life. Now granted, that might be because she has had a rough upbringing. That is true with Freeman as well. He was part of the 60s, granted. He wasn't the most prominent person in the 60s of the civil rights, but he still was part of it. They both had a rough time, a rough history, in a sense, that they had to go through. And they've just almost given up and are just settling for whatever is easiest or whatever is the most profitable. Alright? And that kind of is their biggest flaw, that they have gone through so much, but they've just given up like the pessimistics. But unlike the pessimists, in a sense like the optimists, they are still hoping for goodness in the world, and they're still trying to find it. So they're kind of a weird mixed hybrid between the ignorant and the pessimistic, in a sense. Finally, interestingly enough, the final two people are the two biggest characters in the story. I'm going to talk about them separately and then kind of tie them in a sense. The first one is the innocent, or as I like to call the product. And the way it works is the two characters for this that fall into this category are Riley Freeman and Candide. All right. Now the way Riley is kind of categorized is he is going to be the next gangster, the next person who is going to become the next mob boss, or a person who exemplifies everything with almost African American culture. He is the stereotypical punk kid who spray paints, he smokes, he wants rims, he wants to go gangster. He's constantly trying to show himself as really huge and really big when really he doesn't know what's going on. And in a sense, Candide, he's kind of a product of his environment. The idea of the black culture and how we're all free and we are all our own individual stuff. Candide is the very same way. He starts off naive and innocent and constantly trying to find his own way and have the world implement to his philosophy that this is the best of all possible worlds. But he's constantly met with opposition to that idea. They both are easily influenced, in a sense. There's actually a really good episode where Riley meets one of his idols, I think it was Thugnificent, who actually is a really big-time rapper to him, and he easily gets into his gang, and over time he realizes that his gang member, his idol, isn't as big and grand as he thought. He's just an ordinary guy with ordinary problems. And it kind of hurts Riley in a sense to see that his world is kind of crashing down on him. He's not a real gangster, he's just a fake gangster, a pretend person. And it's kind of a realization to him in a sense that it is kind of a little bit of a pretend himself. Granted, he lies to himself to try to keep up the reality, but he's still is coming to that subconsciously that that this is not the gangster paradise he thinks it is. The same thing with Candide can be said. He's constantly trying to prove to himself that this is the best of worlds, even though the world decides to prove him otherwise. And the interesting thing is they each have a turning point where they realize that their dreams of what the world should be isn't true. And depending on how they react is kind of, interestingly enough, what separates them from the defier. See, the thing is with the innocents, they are constantly in denial, in a sense. They're constantly still questioning. It takes a lot of evidence to finally convince them that what they see is true. And half the time it doesn't always convince them. Candide, in the end, does mature and realize that this isn't the best of all possible worlds when he meets the African-American slave named Martin, not to be associated with this Martin right here. And the thing is about him is that he's starting to get his own ideas. He's starting to cultivate his own thinking, which then later on moves him into the defier. But however, Riley, he still stays in that throughout the series. He still stays ignorant and in denial, constantly trying to prove to himself and to the other people that he can succeed and that he is living the right path. But if you want to talk about the real person who is the true person who really is the ideal in both situations, you got to realize that they're the defier. Now there are two kind of extremes to this. I will point out right here and now. Huey Freeman is a lot more proactive in his defiance. He's been labeled a few times as a terrorist. He's openly defied things. He's broken the law a few times, and he's kind of been a lot more free-spirited than Cacombo has. But the thing with Cacombo is he's not really defying laws in a sense, but rather social positions. He's the guy who's willing to help save Candide when he accidentally kills his brother. He's the one that helps him escape and deceive. He's quick-witted, he's powerful, he's smart, and he knows how the world works, and he uses that to both their advantages. He's the guy who's willing to understand the world and tries to find a happy medium in a sense. In a sense, he's kind of like the moocher where they understand that the world is broken and that it is not perfect, but unlike where they're just settling, unlike the moochers who just settle for whatever is best, the defiers are the ones who try to make the reality their own. They're the ones that are trying to create actual change or help to create that change. And the interesting thing is usually they're foiled to the innocents in a sense because they are the ones who usually work the best with them in a sense. Huey and Riley are brothers, and they often play off each other, especially in the original comics where usually it was just the two of them talking. The two different ideas constantly battling with each other, especially in the original comics by Magruder. And with Cacombo and Candide, most of the book is just them working off each other and trying to find ways to make sense of the world. There's a really good bit where Candide is like, when Candide and Cacombo save these women from a bunch of apes, but it turns out they were lovers. And Candide doesn't exactly understand it, but Cacombo understands it and says, sometimes the world can be a little crazy. There's nothing really we can do about it except work on ourselves. That's kind of the thing with the Defier. They're the people who are willing to get things done. They're willing to stand up for what they believe in. They're strong, firm, and they are, above all, they're willing to change. They're willing to compromise, in a sense. Now, they do have limits, especially towards the end. They are limited. They aren't perfect, which is why they are still relatable. Cacombo, towards the end of the novel, gets really complaining and bitter because he's had a crap. He's trying, and he's succeeded in many regards, but he's still having difficulties in others. Huey, on the other hand, has had his breaking points where he just doesn't understand it and everything, and he doesn't have all the answers. He has a lot of answers, but he doesn't have all of them. He's always questioning why, in the series, why people can be so stupid and ignorant, especially in the R. Kelly case I referenced earlier with Dubois. During that, he was actually really confused why the jury decided to vindicate and release R. Kelly just because he's a famous African American. He actually says a speech where he says, yes, the government does try to incarcerate a lot of innocent black men on fallacious charges, but R. Kelly is not one of them. If you want to help R. Kelly, don't release him, get him help, get him therapy. And the same thing with Cacombo. He is the guy who is trying to make the most sense of the world, and he's the guy who usually has the most answers, and is the guy who's able to get them through things. He's the guy who helps out Candide get through his life. But sometimes people just don't listen to him, just like with Riley. They feel they're the ones who are